The American frontier was a promise written in blood. In the 1800s, as the nation stretched its limbs across a continent, families packed their wagons and their dreams and ventured into the vast, unbroken expanse of the West. They went for land, for freedom, for a chance to build something that would outlast them. They went with hope in their hearts and the knowledge that the frontier was unforgiving, that the wilderness could kill you, that the elements could break you, that the isolation could unmake you. But what they did not expect, what no traveler on the great roads of the frontier could have anticipated, was that the greatest danger would not come from the wildness of the land. It would come from the warmth of a hearth. It would come from a smile at the door. It would come from the very people who offered shelter, who promised safety, who extended a hand of welcome to the weary traveler. And then, when the fire burned low and the night grew deep, closed that hand into a fist. This is the story of the sinister inheritance of the 1800s. It is the story of families who built their fortunes not on the labor of their hands, but on the blood of strangers. It is the story of farms where the soil was rich with something other than crops, of inns where the beds were warm but the welcome was a trap, of a legacy of evil that was buried in the ground, and that the earth itself seemed reluctant to release. These are not legends whispered around campfires. These are historical records, documented cases, stories that were told in courthouses and newspapers, stories that horrified a nation and left a stain on the frontier that can still be felt today, if you know where to look. The most infamous of these stories, the one that has become the archetype for every tale of frontier horror that followed, begins not in a dark forest or a remote mountain pass, but in a place that seemed, on the surface, to offer nothing but opportunity. The place was a small creek in southeastern Kansas, a meandering waterway called Cherry Creek. The year was 1871. The frontier was still wild, but civilization was pushing westward, carving roads through the prairie, building towns, creating the arteries of commerce that would connect the Atlantic to the Pacific. One of those roads was the Osage Trail, a route that carried settlers, traders, and fortune seekers from the settled lands of Missouri into the promise of the West. And on that road, at a bend in Cherry Creek, a small cabin appeared. It was a simple structure, a one-room log building with a lean-to addition, a place that seemed unremarkable in every way. Above the door, a white cloth was tied to a pole, a signal to travelers that here in the wilderness there was food, there was drink, there was a bed for the night. It was a trading post, a general store, a place of refuge on a long and lonely road. The family who ran this establishment called themselves the Benders. There was John Bender, a man in his 50s, a farmer and a preacher who conducted spiritualist meetings in the cabin, drawing in the local settlers with promises of communication with the dead. There was his wife, Elvira, a stout woman with a hard face and a harder demeanor. There was their daughter, Kate, a young woman in her early 20s, described by those who saw her as striking, with dark hair and intense eyes, a woman who possessed a magnetism that drew men to her. And there was her brother, John Jr., a quiet, brooding young man who kept to himself and did the heavy labor around the property. They were, by all appearances, a typical frontier family, carving out a living at the crossroads of civilization and wilderness. But appearances, on the American frontier, were often a mask. And behind the mask of the Bender family was something that would, within 2 years, become a legend of horror that would echo through American history. The first sign that something was wrong came not from the Benders themselves, but from the road. Travelers on the Osage Trail began to notice that people were disappearing, not just one or two, but many. Men who had set out from Missouri with pockets full of cash, heading west to buy land or start businesses, simply never arrived at their destinations. Families who had been seen passing through the area were never heard from again. At first, the disappearances were attributed to the dangers of the frontier, bandits, Indians, accidents, the wilderness itself. But as the months passed and the list of missing persons grew, a pattern began to emerge. The last known location of many of these travelers was the same. It was a small trading post on Cherry Creek, run by a family called Bender. The first person to voice suspicion was a doctor named William York, who lived in the nearby town of Independence. His brother, Dr. John York, had been traveling west to join him. He had been seen at the Bender cabin. He had never arrived. Dr. York rode out to the Bender property himself, a journey of several hours through the prairie to ask questions. He found the Benders polite, accommodating, sympathetic. They remembered his brother, they said. He had stopped for a meal, paid for his supplies, and continued on his way. They had no idea what might have become of him. Dr. York had no cause to disbelieve them. He thanked them and rode away. But something about the family nagged at him. The way Kate watched him as he left. The way the younger Bender, John Jr., seemed to be studying the road, not the fields. The way the dogs on the property, which should have been barking at a stranger, were silent. He filed his suspicion away, a small, persistent unease that he could not shake. The disappearances continued. A Dutch immigrant named George Newton Lonker, traveling with his wife and infant daughter, was seen at the Bender cabin. They were never seen again. A man named Ben Brown, a former soldier carrying a considerable sum of money, stopped at the cabin. He vanished. A widow named Mrs. B. F. McCrotty, traveling alone with her 2 children, was last seen approaching the Bender property. She and her children disappeared as completely as if the earth had swallowed them. Each time the Benders expressed sympathy, offered theories, pointed to the dangers of the road. And each time the list of the missing grew longer. What no traveler could have known, what no visitor to that small cabin on Cherry Creek could have seen, was what lay beneath the floor. The Benders had built their enterprise on a foundation of blood. The cabin was constructed over a cellar, a pit dug into the earth that was accessible through a trapdoor hidden beneath a canvas tarp in the main room. In that cellar, the Benders had created a killing floor. Travelers who stopped for a meal were seated at a long table, with John Bender and Kate on one side, the guest on the other. The guest was given the seat of honor, the seat that placed his back to the canvas tarp. While the conversation flowed, while the food was served, while the traveler relaxed in the warmth of the cabin and the hospitality of his hosts, John Jr. would slip into the cellar, silent as a shadow. He would position himself beneath the tarp, a hammer in his hand, and at a signal from Kate, a word, a gesture, a shift in the conversation, he would drive a nail through the tarp and into the back of the traveler's skull. The blow was swift, precise, almost silent. The victim would slump forward onto the table, dead before he knew what had happened. The Benders would then search the body for money and valuables, strip the clothing, and lower the body into the cellar. When the cellar was full, they would carry the bodies out into the night, to a field behind the cabin, where they had prepared a different kind of soil. The field was an orchard, a grove of fruit trees that the Benders had planted. The trees grew well. They grew better than any trees in the county. Their fruit was abundant, their branches heavy, their roots sinking deep into the Kansas earth. No one questioned why the Bender orchard was so fertile. No one dug beneath the trees. No one knew that the roots were feeding on something that should have been left in the ground. The bodies of the Benders' victims were buried in that orchard, in shallow graves that were covered and replanted, the earth smoothed over, the evidence hidden. How many travelers met their end beneath those trees? The records are incomplete. The official count when the bodies were finally discovered was 11, but the Benders had been operating for nearly 2 years. The number of missing persons who had last been seen on the Osage Trail was much higher. The true number, the number that will never be known, is whispered by historians and true crime scholars to be as high as 20 or 30 or more. The orchard was not the only grave. The prairie itself, the vast, unbroken grassland that stretched for miles in every direction, held secrets that would never be found. The end came not through the investigation of law enforcement, for there was no law in that part of Kansas, no sheriff, no judge, no court within 100 miles. It came through the persistence of one man, a man who refused to let his brother's disappearance fade into the dust of the frontier. Dr. William York, the man who had visited the Bender cabin and left with a feeling of unease, had not forgotten. He had not stopped asking questions. He had not stopped gathering information. He had spoken to every traveler who had passed the Bender property, had collected every rumor, every suspicion, every half-remembered detail. And in the spring of 1873, he brought his findings to a gathering of citizens in Independence. He told them about his brother. He told them about the Lonker family, the Brown man, the McCrotty widow and her children. He told them about the pattern, the last known location, the polite but evasive answers of the Benders. And he told them that he believed, with a certainty that had hardened in his chest over 2 years of searching, that his brother and all the others had been murdered by the family on Cherry Creek. The citizens of Independence were not law enforcement. They were farmers, merchants, tradesmen, men who had built their lives on the frontier and who understood that sometimes, when the law was absent, justice had to be delivered by the hands of the community. They formed a posse. 20 men, armed and mounted, rode out to the Bender cabin on a morning in March. They expected resistance. They expected to confront the family, to demand answers, to search the property. What they found instead was silence. The cabin was empty. The Benders were gone. The fire was cold in the hearth. The table was bare. The shelves that had once held supplies for travelers were stripped clean. The family had vanished, leaving behind only the cabin and the land and the secrets buried in the soil. The posse searched the cabin. It was a simple structure, a single room with a lean-to, and at first they found nothing. But one of the men, a farmer named Jim Bort, noticed something strange about the floor. In one corner the earth seemed disturbed, the packed dirt looser than the rest. He called the others. They began to dig. Within minutes they uncovered a trapdoor. Beneath it, a cellar. And in that cellar they found the evidence that would confirm their darkest fears. The floor of the cellar was stained dark, the smell of decay so strong that the first man to descend retched and had to be pulled back up. They found a hammer, still stained with blood and hair. They found a collection of personal effects, watches, rings, pocket knives, clothing, that could only have come from a dozen different people. They found a woman's bonnet, a child's shoe, a man's pocket watch with the name John York engraved on the inside. And they found beneath the cellar floor a shallow grave containing the remains of several bodies, hastily buried, their skulls crushed, their hands bound. The posse moved to the orchard. They began to dig beneath the fruit trees, those trees that had grown so tall, so strong, so heavy with fruit. The first body was found beneath a pear tree, the roots of the tree wrapped around the skeleton like fingers holding what was theirs. Then another. Then another. The men dug all day and into the night, their lanterns casting long shadows across the field, the bodies emerging from the earth like a harvest of bones. By the time they were done, they had exhumed the remains of 11 people. Some were adults, some were children. Some had been there so long that only bones remained. Others were more recent, their clothing still intact, their faces still recognizable to those who had known them. The Bender orchard, it turned out, had not been planted for fruit. It had been planted to hide the dead. And the roots of those trees had been drinking for nearly 2 years on a fertilizer that no farmer would have chosen. The community was horrified. The story spread across Kansas, across the frontier, across the nation. Newspapers called the Benders the Bloody Benders, the murderers of Cherry Creek, the family of fiends. The posse hunted for the fugitives, following leads across the prairie into Indian territory, onto the ships that sailed from the Gulf of Mexico. They never found them. The Benders had vanished as completely as their victims, swallowed by the same frontier that they had used to hide their crimes. John Bender, Elvira, Kate, John Jr. They disappeared into history, leaving behind only the cabin, the orchard, and a legacy of evil that would haunt the American imagination for generations. But the story of the Benders is not the only story of a sinister inheritance on the American frontier. It is the most famous, the one that has become legend, but it is not the first. Before the Benders, before Cherry Creek, before Kansas was even a state, there were others who built their fortunes on the blood of travelers. And the most notorious of these, the men who set the pattern for every murder in and remote farm that followed, were a pair of brothers whose names became synonymous with terror on the frontier. Their names were Micajah and Wiley Harpe. They were known in the dark annals of American history as the Harpe brothers, and they were the first serial killers in the United States. The Harpe brothers were not farmers or innkeepers, not at first. They were loyalists during the Revolutionary War, men who had fought for the British crown, and when the war was lost, found themselves on the wrong side of a new nation. They were men without a country, without a cause, without any restraint on the violence that burned within them. They drifted south, into the frontier territories of Kentucky and Tennessee, where the law was weak and the wilderness was vast. They took up with outlaws, horse thieves, river pirates, men who lived on the margins of society and preyed on those who traveled through the wild country. But the Harpe brothers were not content to steal horses or rob travelers. They killed, and they killed not for necessity, not for survival, but for something darker. They killed for pleasure. The first documented murder by the Harpe brothers occurred in 1797, near Knoxville, Tennessee. A man named Johnson, a traveler on the Wilderness Road, was found dead on the trail, his body mutilated beyond recognition. The Harpe brothers were seen in the area. They were questioned. They were released for lack of evidence. And they moved on, leaving behind a trail of bodies that would stretch across the frontier for 3 years. They killed men, women, children, entire families. They killed travelers on the road, settlers in their cabins, traders on the river. They killed with their hands, with knives, with guns, with whatever was at hand. They killed and they kept killing, moving from place to place, leaving behind a wake of horror that the settlers of Kentucky and Tennessee had never seen before. The Harpe brothers were not subtle. They did not hide their victims in cellars or bury them under orchards. They left them where they fell, by the side of the road, in the cabins they had robbed, in the fields where they had been overtaken. The bodies were found. The story spread. And soon, the name Harpe became a curse word on the frontier, a name that mothers used to frighten their children into obedience, a name that travelers whispered when they saw strangers on the road. The Harpe brothers were the first American boogeymen, and they were real. Their method was simple. They would approach travelers on the road, posing as friendly settlers, men of the frontier who knew the country and could offer guidance. They would offer to share a campfire, to travel together for safety, to help with a broken wagon or a lame horse. And when their victims were off guard, when they were relaxed, when they had let their guard down around these friendly, helpful men, the Harpe brothers would strike. They would kill quickly, efficiently, without mercy. And then they would take everything the traveler had, money, supplies, weapons, clothing, and move on to the next road, the next traveler, the next victim. What set the Harpe brothers apart from other outlaws of the frontier was not just the number of their victims, though that number is estimated to be as high as 40 or more. It was the nature of their violence. They did not kill because they had to. They killed because they wanted to. They killed with a casualness, an indifference that chilled the blood of those who survived their encounters. One of the few survivors of a Harpe attack, a man named William Kirk, later testified that after the brothers had robbed him and left him for dead, he heard them laughing as they rode away. They had killed his wife. They had killed his children. They had shot him and left him in the road, and they were laughing. The end of the Harpe brothers came not through the hands of the law, for there was no law in the Kentucky wilderness that could reach them. It came through the fury of a community that had endured too much, that had lost too many, that had finally decided that the frontier would no longer tolerate the monsters it had produced. In 1799, a posse of settlers cornered the brothers near the town of Henderson, Kentucky. In the shootout that followed, one of the brothers, Wiley, was killed. His head was cut off and placed on a pole at a crossroads, a warning to any who would follow in his footsteps. The other brother, Mikeja, escaped into the wilderness, but he was tracked, hunted, and eventually captured by a group of settlers who had lost family members to his violence. He was executed without trial, his body dismembered, his head joining his brother's on a pole at a different crossroads. The Harpe brothers were dead, but the legacy they left behind, the pattern they had established, the knowledge that the frontier could produce such evil, would not die with them. The Harpe brothers and the Bender family represent two ends of a spectrum, two expressions of the same dark inheritance. The Harpe brothers were wanderers, killers who moved through the frontier like a plague, leaving death in their wake and disappearing into the wilderness before the community could respond. The Benders were settlers, killers who put down roots, who built a home, who created a place of apparent safety and used it as a trap. But both understood the same truth about the American frontier, that it was a place where a man could disappear, where a family could vanish, where the earth itself could swallow the evidence of the worst crimes. If the criminals were patient, if they were careful, if they were willing to let the wilderness hide what they had done. There were others. The frontier was vast, and the opportunities for evil were limitless. In the 1820s, a man named John A. Murrell, known as the Great Western Land Pirate, operated a network of thieves and murderers across the Mississippi River Valley, with hidden camps and secret caches where his gang would dispose of the bodies of their victims. In the 1830s, a family called the Harkness operated a tavern on the Ohio River that became known as the Murder Tavern, where travelers were robbed and killed, and their bodies dumped into the river. In the 1840s, a man named Thomas Carr, known as Old Tom, ran a trading post in the Ozark Mountains where travelers who carried gold were never seen again. In the 1850s, a family called the Watsons operated a farm in Indiana that became a way station on the Underground Railroad, or so they claimed. In reality, they were robbing and killing the freedom seekers who trusted them, burying the bodies in a field behind the barn, a field that, like the Bender orchard, grew crops that were too lush, too green, too abundant to be natural. Each of these cases follows a pattern: the remote location, the friendly welcome, the meal shared, the conversation, the relaxation of the traveler's guard, the sudden violence, the theft, the burial, the disappearance, and then eventually the discovery. A cellar full of belongings, a field full of bones, a community that realizes too late that the evil was not in the wilderness but in the hearth. The pattern is so consistent, so repeated across the frontier, that it becomes not just a collection of isolated crimes, but a phenomenon, a dark inheritance that the American frontier passed down to itself, generation after generation, as if the land itself demanded a tribute of blood. What drove these families to such evil? What made them turn their homes into traps, their hearths into killing floors, their fields into graveyards? The answers are not simple. The frontier was a place of desperation, of poverty, of isolation. For a family struggling to survive on marginal land, the money carried by travelers must have seemed like a gift, an easy solution to a life of hard labor. The first killing might have been an accident, a crime of opportunity, a moment of violence that could not be undone. But then, as the body was buried, as the money was counted, as the travelers kept coming and the family kept killing, something changed. The desperation became greed. The greed became habit. The habit became a legacy. And the legacy was passed down from parent to child, from brother to sister, until the family was no longer a family at all, but a machine for killing, an enterprise built on blood. There is also the question of the land itself. The frontier was not empty. It was not a blank slate waiting to be written upon. It was ancient, old as the continent, old as the mountains, old as the rivers that carved their way through the prairie. The people who lived there before the settlers arrived, the Native American tribes who had called these lands home for thousands of years, understood something that the settlers often forgot. The land remembers. The land holds. The land does not forget what is buried in it. The Cherokee, the Creek, the Shawnee, They had their own stories of places that were cursed, of ground that should not be disturbed, of sites where evil had been done and the earth itself had become tainted. The settlers, in their rush to claim the land, to build their farms and their towns and their roads, ignored those stories. They planted orchards on ground that should have been left fallow. They built cabins on sites that should have been avoided. They thought they were taming the wilderness. But the wilderness, it seems, had its own way of taming them. The Bender orchard is gone now. The cabin is gone. The town of Cherry Creek is a ghost, its name preserved only in the records of the county, its location marked by a small stone monument that few people visit and fewer remember. But the land is still there. The prairie still stretches to the horizon. The wind still moves through the grass. The sun still sets in a blaze of orange and red behind the low hills. And if you go to that place, if you stand on the ground where the Bender cabin once stood, you might feel something. A heaviness in the air. A silence that is deeper than the usual silence of the prairie. A sense, perhaps, that the land is still holding something, still keeping a secret, still waiting for the day when it will be released. The story of the Benders and the Harpe brothers and all the others like them is not just a story of crime. It is a story of inheritance. The inheritance of violence, of greed, of the willingness to see another human being not as a person, but as a thing, a resource, a means to an end. That inheritance was not limited to the frontier. It was carried westward. As the nation expanded, as the roads grew longer and the towns grew larger, as the frontier became the settled land, and the settled land became the nation we know today. It was passed down from generation to generation, from family to family, from place to place. And it is still with us in the stories we tell, in the fears we carry, in the knowledge that the people we trust, the people who invite us into their homes, the people who smile and offer us a seat by the fire, may not be what they seem. There is a document, a letter, that was found in the Bender cabin after the family fled. It was written by Kate Bender, the daughter, the woman with the dark hair and the intense eyes, the woman who sat at the table and talked to the travelers while her brother waited beneath the floor with his hammer. The letter was never sent. It was addressed to no one. It was found folded in a drawer, hidden beneath a pile of cloth, as if Kate had written it and then thought better of sending it. The letter reads in part, "I have done things that cannot be undone. I have seen things that cannot be unseen. The soil of this place is rich with what we have buried. The trees grow tall on what we have given them. And I wonder sometimes when the wind blows across the prairie, if the land is trying to tell someone what we have done, if it is waiting for the day when it will speak." The land did speak. It spoke through the posse that dug beneath the orchard. It spoke through the bones that emerged from the soil. It spoke through the stories that spread across the frontier and into the history books. But the land did not speak of everything. It kept some secrets. It always keeps some secrets. The Benders were never found. Their fate remains unknown. Some say they made their way to California, where they changed their names and lived out their lives in obscurity. Some say they were killed by Indians in the Oklahoma Territory, their bodies left to rot on the prairie. Some say they returned to Germany, the family's country of origin, and disappeared into the anonymity of the old world. And some say they never left. Some say they are still there, on the prairie, in the land that they tainted, their bones buried in the same soil that holds the bones of their victims, their legacy woven into the grass and the wind and the heavy silence that hangs over Cherry Creek. The Harpe brothers were found. Their heads were mounted on poles at crossroads, a warning to others who might follow their path. But the warning did not work. The frontier was too vast, the temptation too great, the darkness too deep within the human heart. The Harpe brothers were the first serial killers in America, but they were not the last. The pattern they established, the pattern of the friendly stranger who becomes the deadly predator, of the remote cabin that becomes a trap, of the road that leads not to safety but to death, has been repeated again and again, in every generation, in every place where people travel and strangers meet. The legacy of the Harpe brothers is not just a historical footnote. It is a part of the American story, a thread woven into the fabric of the nation, a reminder that the frontier, for all its promise, was also a place of terror. The sinister inheritance of the 1800s is not just the story of the Benders and the Harpe brothers. It is the story of every family who looked at the travelers on the road and saw not people but profit. It is the story of every cabin where a meal was served and a life was taken. It is the story of every field where the crops grew too tall, too green, too abundant, because the soil had been enriched with something that should never have been buried. It is the story of the American frontier itself, a place of dreams and nightmares, of hope and horror, of a promise that was written in blood. The historians who study these cases often focus on the facts: the number of victims, the method of killing, the fate of the perpetrators. But there is something beyond the facts, something that the facts cannot capture. It is the feeling of those places, the weight of what happened there, the sense that the land itself is still holding the memory of the evil that was done. If you go to the site of the Bender cabin today, you will find a small stone marker, placed there by the Kansas Historical Society, a reminder of the tragedy that occurred on that spot. But the marker does not tell the whole story. It does not tell you about the silence that falls when you stand there, about the way the wind seems to pause, about the feeling that you are being watched, not by anything that can be seen, but by the land itself, which has not forgotten what it was asked to hold. There is a story, told by the farmers who still work the land around Cherry Creek, that on certain nights, when the moon is full and the wind is still, you can see lights moving across the field where the orchard once stood. Small lights flickering, moving in patterns that have no explanation. The farmers call them the Bender lights. They do not talk about them much. They do not like to talk about them. But they know, as the land knows, that something was left unfinished there, something that has not been laid to rest, something that still moves through the prairie when the conditions are right, when the veil is thin, when the dead are restless. The Harpe brothers have their own legends. In Kentucky, on the Wilderness Road, there are places where travelers still report feeling a sudden chill, a sense of dread, a feeling that they are being followed. The locals will tell you, if you ask, that the Harpe brothers still walk that road, still hunt for victims, still kill. They will tell you that the heads that were mounted on poles at the crossroads did not end the evil, did not contain it, did not bury it deep enough. They will tell you that the Harpe brothers are still out there in the wilderness, waiting for the next traveler to come along. These are stories, of course. They are legends, myths, the kind of tales that grow up around any tragedy, any horror, any event that is too terrible to be contained by the facts. But there is truth in them, a truth that goes beyond the facts. The truth is that the frontier was a place where the rules of civilization did not apply, where people could become something other than what they were, where the darkness in the human heart could grow unchecked, nurtured by isolation and desperation, and the knowledge that no one was watching, no one was coming, no one would ever know. The truth is that the Benders and the Harpe brothers and all the others like them were not monsters. They were people. They were people who made choices, terrible choices, choices that led them down a path from which there was no return. And the truth is that the capacity for that choice exists in all of us, in the quiet moments when we think no one is looking, in the desperate times when survival seems to require something we never thought we could do. The sinister inheritance of the 1800s is not just a historical curiosity. It is a mirror. It shows us what we are capable of, what we can become, when we are cut off from the structures and the values that hold us together. The frontier was a place without law, without community, without the bonds that tie us to each other and to our better selves. In that vacuum, some people built farms and towns and schools and churches. They built civilization out of the wilderness, through hard work and cooperation and faith. And some people built something else. They built killing floors and graveyards and orchards that grew on the bodies of the dead. They built a legacy of evil that would outlast them, that would become legend, that would remind us, for generations, that the line between civilization and savagery is thinner than we think. When the posse dug up the Bender orchard, they found the bodies of 11 people. They found watches and rings and pocket knives and clothing. They found a woman's bonnet and a child's shoe. They found the hammer, still stained, still holding the evidence of what had been done. They did not find everything. The orchard was large, the field was wide, and the posse had only so many hours of daylight. They dug where the ground seemed disturbed, where the trees grew thickest, where the roots had pulled the bones to the surface. They did not dig everywhere. They did not dig deep enough. The Bender orchard, it is said, still holds bodies. The trees that grow there now, the ones that were planted after the cabin was torn down, after the land was cleared, after the memory of what happened began to fade, they still grow tall. They still bear fruit, and their roots, if you were to dig them up, would still find what was left behind. The story of the Benders and the Harpe brothers is a story of inheritance. It is the inheritance of a land that was taken, of a frontier that was won, of a nation that was built on the bodies of the people who were already there and the people who came after. It is the inheritance of violence, of greed, of the belief that some lives matter less than others, that some people are not really people at all, that the traveler on the road is not a soul but a resource. That inheritance has not disappeared. It has been passed down from the 1800s to the present, from the frontier to the city, from the remote cabin to the suburban home. It is in the stories we tell, the fears we carry, the knowledge that the people we trust may not be worthy of that trust. There is a final story, one that is not often told, about the Bender orchard. It is said that after the posse left, after the bodies were reburied in a proper cemetery, after the cabin was torn down and the land was cleared, a farmer came to plant crops on that field. He was a good man, a hard-working man, a man who had heard the stories but did not believe in ghosts. He plowed the field, planted his corn, tended his crops. And when the harvest came, his corn was the tallest in the county, the greenest, the most abundant. He was proud of that corn. He did not question why it grew so well. He did not think about what might be in the soil that made it so fertile. He harvested his corn, sold it at market, and went on with his life. But his neighbors knew. They knew why the corn was so tall. They knew what the roots had found. And they did not eat that corn. They would not touch it. They let the farmer sell it to strangers, to people who did not know the history of that field, who did not know what the land had been asked to hold. And the farmer, eventually, he came to know too. He came to understand why his neighbors would not buy his corn, why they would not look him in the eye when they passed him on the road, why they whispered when they thought he could not hear. He sold the field. He moved away. He never spoke of what he had found when he dug deeper than the plow, what the roots had wrapped themselves around, what the land had kept for him to discover. He took that knowledge with him, a secret he would carry to his grave. And the field that was once the Bender orchard, was left fallow. No one would plant there. No one would build there. The land was left to the grass and the wind and the silence. And the grass grew, and the wind blew, and the silence held, and the land remembered. The sinister inheritance of the 1800s is not a closed chapter. It is not a story that ended with the Bender's flight or the Harpe brothers' death. It is a story that continues, in the places where the land holds what was buried, in the families who carry the legacy of violence, in the travelers who still walk the roads and wonder, sometimes, if the people they meet are what they seem. It is a story that asks us to look at the ground beneath our feet, to question what might be buried there, to remember that the soil of this nation was enriched by things that should never have been put in the ground. It is a story that asks us to consider the inheritance we have received, the inheritance we will pass on, and whether we will be the ones who finally lay it to rest. The Bender family was never found. The Harpe brothers were killed, but their legacy lived on. The frontier is gone now, settled and tamed, crossed by highways and dotted with cities. But the roads are still there. The travelers are still there. And somewhere, in the quiet places, in the remote farms and the isolated inns, in the places where the land is still wild and the law is still distant, there may be families who have inherited more than just the land. They may have inherited the knowledge that the soil can hold anything, that the roots will take whatever they are given, that a traveler on the road is just another resource, another contribution to the fertility of the field. They may have inherited the legacy of the Benders, the Harpe brothers, the murder inns and the remote farms, the darkness that was planted on the frontier and has never been fully uprooted. If you travel the back roads of America, if you leave the highways and venture into the places where the maps go blank, you may come across a farm that seems too prosperous, a field that seems too green, a family that seems too welcoming. You may be offered a meal, a bed, a place to rest. You may sit at a table, your back to a door, and talk with strangers who smile and ask about your journey, your destination, the money in your pocket. And if you do, if you find yourself in such a place, you might remember the Benders. You might remember the Harpe brothers. You might remember the orchard and the cellar and the hammer beneath the floor. You might remember that the frontier is not a place you leave behind. It is a place you carry with you, in the stories you tell, in the fears you hold, in the knowledge that the people who smile and offer you a seat by the fire may not be what they seem. The sinister inheritance of the 1800s is not a history lesson. It is a warning. It is a reminder that the darkness that was planted on the frontier did not die with the Benders, did not end with the Harpe brothers, did not fade when the frontier was settled and the roads were paved. It is still there, in the soil, in the roots, in the places where the land remembers what it was asked to hold. And it is waiting, as it has always waited, for the next traveler to come along. There is a final document, a piece of paper that was found in the Bender cabin after the family fled, hidden beneath the floorboards, in the same cellar where the killings took place. It was a letter written in Kate Bender's hand, a letter that was never sent, a letter that was never meant to be read. It said, in part, "I have tried to leave this place. I have tried to forget what we have done, but the land will not let me go. It holds me, it holds all of us. The roots are deep, the soil is rich, and we are part of it now as much as the bodies we buried. We cannot leave, we can only wait, we can only watch. We can only listen for the sound of footsteps on the road, for the knock at the door, for the voice that asks for shelter. And when it comes, we will do what we have always done, because that is what the land requires. That is what the land has always required. That is the inheritance we have been given. The Benders were never found, but perhaps they never left. Perhaps they are still there, in the orchard that was plowed under, in the field that was left fallow, in the land that holds what it was given. Perhaps they are waiting, as Kate wrote, for the sound of footsteps on the road, for the knock at the door, for the traveler who will come and sit at the table and turn his back to the canvas tarp. Perhaps the sinister inheritance of the 1800s is not a story of the past. Perhaps it is a story of the present, a story that is still being written, in the quiet places, on the back roads, in the farms and inns and cabins where the land remembers and the roots are deep. Perhaps the next time you travel, the next time you leave the highway and venture into the places where the maps go blank, you will find a door, a light, a smile, a welcome, and you will have to decide in that moment whether to step inside. The frontier is gone, but the darkness that grew there has not disappeared. It has been inherited, passed down, buried in the soil and planted in the roots. And it is waiting, as it has always waited, for the next traveler, the next knock, the next welcome that is not a welcome at all. The sinister inheritance of the 1800s is yours now. It is ours. It is the inheritance of a nation built on blood, of a frontier that was won at a cost we can never fully calculate, of a land that holds what it is given and does not forget. The question is not whether the inheritance exists. The question is what we will do with it. Will we bury it deeper, plant over it, pretend it is not there? Or will we dig it up, bring it into the light, and finally, after all these years, lay it to rest? The choice is ours. But the land is watching. The land is waiting. The land remembers. And the inheritance, the sinister inheritance of the 1800s is still there, beneath our feet, waiting to be claimed.